Podcast that we are sort of doing is part of an ongoing series called Analyst Collective of Officers. The basic idea behind Analyst Collective is an initiative that sort of helps people break into Web3 VC. And the idea is that every second week we try to bring in a sort of a pillar of the Web3 VC world like you, and have them for an hour engage with the audience here. The audience is fairly a good mix of enthusiasts and students that are part of a Telegram group that we have. The every second other week where we don't sort of do these calls, we usually jam on a deal. So I'll share a Web3 startup pitch deck, and everybody gets on a call and we decide whether the startup is investment worthy or not. And the highlights of the call are shared on the group post that call. So yeah, I'll give it over to Tanay, who would be sort of doing the interview, and we can get going from there.
Thank you so much, Ayush. And yeah, as Thomas, Ayush just picked it out. If you could please introduce yourself, Geometry, your journey from being a founder and then turning an investor. How has your kind of trajectory been? And we'd love to kind of get an insight into that.
Yeah, so well, nice to meet you all. Thanks very much for having me. So my name's Tom Walton-Pocock. I am one of the two founders at Geometry, which is a research house, research laboratory with a kind of specialization in applied cryptography and zero knowledge proving systems. And it was formed about 2 years ago, actually with a slightly sort of bigger founding team than is here today, and we sort of became increasingly focused on sort of infrastructure and wanted to sort of narrow down our focus just on infrastructure. We are a very early stage investor, so we typically would try to be the first investment into a company. Mostly companies building in Web3, but not all building in Web3. And increasingly our interests are broadening beyond Web3, still staying with sort of deep research based companies, and mostly applications of cryptography to the new stateful internet, I guess is a sort of succinct way to put it. And before Geometry, I was one of the founders at Aztec Network, which is a layer 2 on Ethereum. I guess sort of probably best known for being the birthplace of Plonk, which is one of the main universal snark systems that's now helping to sort of scale and bring privacy to Ethereum. So yeah,
that's amazing. I think you mentioned Plonk, and that's something I definitely want to get into. And it's actually really cool that I just found out that you are one of the first tech companies in your investments, right? It's very research driven, and you try to kind of support founders at a very early stage. So what does the Geometry thesis look like? And how do you kind of support these founders when you're deciding on making an investment? Could you please give us a little more insight into your investment process and your thesis?
So maybe to sort of first of all, how we work with founders, which is maybe a little bit unusual. I will say, by the way, there's no question that Paradigm set the tone for how to do a kind of research first investing in particularly in Web3. I would imagine there've probably been some investors that have done this sort of thing in the past outside Web3, but there's no question they sort of set that template. We obviously have just this particularly narrow specialism. We do a lot of research with companies, particularly within the first year and a half of their existence. Sometimes it'll be for core pieces of infrastructure that they need to be built. So we did something quite recently on the custody and sort of BLS signature side. We will sometimes it'll be sort of more experimental work that maybe the company doesn't want to make a sort of a core component of their research, but they think that it could be a sort of greenfield area where the future of their company might actually lie in some sort of research breakthrough that originates from that interaction. And so yes, so we talked a little bit about investment process. We invest in companies basically often right at the start of their existence. They may be really newly formed, a matter of sort of months or less. And we are trying to make sure that we're disciplined about investing largish checks, so sort of ideally $1 to $2 million as a first check-in, and getting sort of not so much ownership that we encumber the cap table, but enough that we're sort of in high single figures is generally what we try to target. As far as the investment process itself, I guess maybe where Geometry is a little bit different from some other investors is we spend quite a lot of time. We do think a lot about network effects, and network effects being a sort of shorthand for some future optionality for the company to monetize. But we also focus on sort of any residual, what I call trust premium, that might lie around the protocol that they are building. So sort of maybe a layer 2 is quite a good example. I think the jury on something like a layer 2 company is a little bit out in the sense of, can they extract a meaningful share of the value that they create? Now, actually, even if they don't, it might be they can still extract enormous amount of value, right? But the analogy I often use for the L2s is there is always the risk that it could end up being having an economic model that kind of looks like the telco's value extraction from the internet, which is it sees the bits and the bytes, and it has this sort of, fairly sort of monopolistic service that sort of carries the physical, sort of the data that ultimately connects the internet up. But it didn't see quite enough of the user behavior or the product to be able to do discriminatory pricing, which is actually what a lot of sort of freemium and sort of and SaaS models are predicated on. So we always try to, as I say, we try to look what's the bit that where the trust is being completely extinguished from the model. And often, by the way, where the brain power is going is not necessarily where the trust premium resides and the value extraction resides. So the interesting thing about zero knowledge proofs as a category is that every time you deploy them to try to scale something like Ethereum, you're working as hard as you possibly can to reduce reliance on some centralized entity, which is precisely the same thing as saying reducing any one entity's pricing power and reducing the ability for a centralized group of people to keep on truing up their margin, which is kind of the opposite of what a company does. And so that's where we try to sit down with founders and say, well, what is your paired business, your paired protocol? Which bit is the bit that's going to be decentralized away and is at the very least is at risk of ending up at subsistence grade economics, and which is the bit where there is a residue of people who still need to trust some service delivered on top of the protocol. So something like a service handles developer deployments, or some sort of developer environment of some description, handles migrations, does threat detection, these sorts of services, security. There's lots of services you can deliver on top where the trust never goes away. I still need to know that the person that I contracted with to do some job on top of the protocol can still extract some value. So we spend a lot of time thinking about that.
I see that there are a bunch of threads that I could pull on over there, but I think one of the things that I find interesting in particular is value capture being particularly hard. And at the same time, you mentioned that solving a hard problem may not necessarily be the place where you'll find that value capture, or where you could be charging that premium, but there could be other avenues of monetization that you could be exploring. Can you please expand on that and share how do you think about monetization models when value capture is essentially critically hard?
I'm not saying that L2s can't capture value at the protocol layer. I'm just saying that the way that they sort of meter what they're seeing is kind of bits and bytes, and they're not really sort of seeing they're not really able to sort of reason about the value that's been captured, for example, by an application, and therefore they're not able to determine, okay, well, how much of that value that we're creating for them, that onward value, can we sort of capture and pull back upstream again? So I would say that the jury's a little bit out. One way to think about it is, can you imagine ever a layer 2, let's say, sort of increasing its margin or its kind of dollar capture per unit of compute? Probably not. Now, that's not the only measure, by the way, that matters, but you could never really see its pricing power increasing on a per transaction or sort of per step basis, or per unit of gas, or however you decide to meet at the transaction. So that's a kind of a good reason where with a classical business, what they will do is they'll continue to amplify utility by producing the next improved, better service, and they will retain the right to be able to keep on increasing the amount of value extraction they get from that user. That can't be said of these sort of L2 protocols. I think L2 protocols are also a little bit different to an L1 in that the L1 protocols are able to play the macroeconomic game. So really, I wouldn't say that ETH in the long run is, if I had to make my bet, I don't think something like ETH is likely to be a cash flow asset. I think it's actually quite likely to be a sort of macroeconomic asset. It's likely to sort of, and the people therefore who decide whether ETH gets to be valuable or not, and therefore whether sort of the people who sort of initially created ETH and the sort of the foundation get to sort of make some sort of financial return, is actually probably it's all of us recursively, and it's a combination of us as individuals and sort of engines of state and commerce and a whole load of people who decide this is our best expression of financial fear, or a sort of a hedge against the world's going wrong, or some kind of sort of monetary instrument, or all of the above. And so it's not really playing a value capture game. It's playing we are a canonical macroeconomic asset. We sit in a basket of assets that express the world's fear. So I do have a sort of carve out for L1 assets. And the other thing is, by the way, they need to exist. Their existence is an input function to the success of the entire industry. You cannot have a layer 1 sort of expression of consensus without an asset of value that is there to economically defend it. I do have plenty of carve-outs for this. And by the way, I also believe that I've obviously been, made a couple of comments on Twitter lately, as you pointed out at the beginning, about the token and the structure of the token. I'm definitely not an anti-tokener at all. I'm just a bit more cautious about sort of, have we really got to a point where we really understand how best to use it as a delivery of ultimate long-run value to the user, and not just a stimulant for adoption, which is very important, by the way. But I think we've also got to have better plans in place to enable those things to capture value.
I think the token conversation is something that I'll hold off on just for a moment. But a previous point that you highlighted, that there is a sort of a tension between it being ETH being a profit maximizing asset versus it being a store of value. And I would go back to first principles and ask you, in your opinion, what makes a good L1, and how do you see the role of L1s changing as it becomes the sole ledger for just posting your data and just recording that, just verify the proofs that come your way. Can you please shed some light on that?
What made a good L1 in the very first place was a universal machine, and what makes a good L1 now might actually be something much less scientific, which is good mythology. The virtue of having a figurehead who's he is alive, and he is tangible, unlike with Bitcoin, which in some ways is a better mythology. But the next best mythology after that is to have someone who is whose I think sort of integrity has been pretty much beyond question, and is very, very clearly here for the right reason. Rather, the hard thing about the L2s, the L1s that came later, is the speculative fever was such that you could never really measure the sort of the integrity of the people coming into the space, whereas with Vitalik, somewhat you could. So I think, you know, these are very sort of non-technical reasons why ETH might be accorded this position in the world's macro assets. Is it just has better mythology than a lot of the other L1s. But I'm not a maximalist here. I frankly don't care where we do business. I'll go anywhere, you know, as far as I'm concerned, anywhere that's kind of secure and performant and whatever. But I do think also ETH now has sort of, it kind of lucked its way into, because it was the first L1 that rubbed up against the edges of a problem with scaling. It also produced this sort of layer 2 first roadmap, which was formally enshrined, I guess, a couple of years ago, which meant that lots of people came to build not just scaling solutions, but also to fiddle around with what is the instruction set that we're offering the engineer. And so it's also turned itself into a kind of accidental ephemeral microchip accelerator. Basically, it's basically the same sort of, it's this new substance for etching the world's computations into a new way of storing data. And it now has the good fortune that there are lots of people running lots of different experiments and etching different ephemeral microchips, virtual machines, into this L1 substance. And so it's now just got optionality. It is basically a developer platform. And I think that's another thing sort of possibly running at its advantage. I've again said elsewhere, who knows what, when we go back visiting the Ethereum virtual machine in the future, what that thing will actually do. Will that instruction set last at L1? Not sure. There's great promise for it continuing to proliferate at L2. And the echo of the Ethereum virtual machine will live on in L2, but I do wonder whether actually we might be calling on the L1 basically for the sake of its precompiles, basically checking the veracity of zero knowledge proofs and doing some sort of basic updates of its sort of records of what's going on at L2, but not actually doing much logic administration at L1. I don't know, but that's definitely a possible end game.
The point you just highlighted, alludes to the point where there is a likelihood that eventually the EVM just becomes a relic where these zero knowledge chains being built on top of it just post the state update combined with the proof that the state update is valid, and the L1's job is just to verify these proofs coming in. With that vision, one of the possibilities that could lead to how things play out in the future. How do you view the EVM as a developer platform? Because I know you are a big proponent of talking about improving the developer experience, but how do you see the developer experience and the focus on EVM as a dev platform changing with this being a possibility in the near term?
Well, I guess the crude answer is you can write longer, more expressive programs. You can execute them more cheaply. I mean, I know it's a really sort of, I guess she also asked a lot, what is the use of zero knowledge proofs? And the reality is, once you can put some sort of complete instruction set into this thing, the answer is sort of everything. Yeah, I guess I don't really know how to answer that question except to say, there's a, yeah, I've also just seen a comment appear, which I'll try to address in a second. Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much the migration from L1 to L2 really does to meaningfully modify and develop experience. I mean, you might see sort of, for example, the use of proofs spring up to add in more expressive precompiles more easily. That might be one thing that you might end up doing. Of course, then you're starting to forfeit the formal codification of a program in order to do that. But that might be one way in which the solidity as a language sort of starts to become a little bit more manipulable. But it's also cheating your way around the system because you're not now encoding your programs in the instruction set that you were supposed to by making the precompiles bigger. In some ways, you sort of have a bigger problem with sort of proper verifiability of the types of programs you're implementing. But
yeah, I think that's definitely some food for thought. I think I'd like to kind of shift gears a little bit and talk about your time at Geometry investing in some really amazing startups. Like I think one of the portfolios that I really kind of follow is Geometries. So can you walk us through a particular investment that you made from start to finish? Any investment that you'd like to talk about, could be in Gonyama or could be Risk Zero, all the way from, how did the deal come to your table? And then how did you go about diligence? And then why did you decide to invest in that particular startup? I think that would be a very good, pipeline that all of us here would be interested in, and I'm pretty sure we can learn from it as well.
So yeah, look, I mean, our three best known investments would have to be Scroll. Scroll, we were one of the first institutional investors in right at the very start. And then Inganyama, which was fairly soon afterwards. And then not too long after that, as you say, Risk Zero. So all quite different. Scroll actually is probably the most crypto native investment that we've ever made. It was also our first. So look, I will say I was this is where sort of investor biases come in. I was very predisposed to like Scroll because it was using Plonk to scale the EVM. And this was something I really liked. And it was sort of definitely always one of the options that was before us at Aztec. And it was just always a sort of quite a hard thing to consider doing. So I was quite predisposed to like it. We also had a little bit of an advantage in that, as it happens, Andy Peng and I were in the same college at the same university in the UK. so the reality is it was that investment was one of the easier ones. It also produced a lot of bias risk for us. Are we investing in this company because we happen to know the team and because we happen to sort of have, a better window into their background? Anyway, that's one. I think also we were able to obviously sort of diligence the Halo 2 work that they were doing, and Ye had an amazing background at the edge of KPs and hardware, and so I think that was. I mean, look, maybe the thing I would say most of all is about sort of how we invest and how maybe it's changed is we started off spending most of our time thinking about the tech. And I think the experience that we've been through basically replicates every seasoned investor who's ever invested well, which is you end up doing a psychological profile on the founder. And that sounds incredibly sinister. But the reality is you want to work out whether the founder is there for the very long run. Like, so are they, maybe so here's a little yellow flag might be something like, founder has discovered this incredibly exciting mathematical territory called ZKPs, learned a lot about it, kind of indifferent to how it's used. You've got to do a lot of work to work out whether the founder is really going to be there in 6, 7, 8 years' time. This sort of what you might call the professor coin problem is a little bit of a problem. You want to know that the founder is technically proficient, so you need to sort of make sure, and we can obviously probe that reasonably well because of the background of the people in geometry. But much harder, which is much easier to game for the founder and much harder for us, therefore, to sort of come to a conviction on is what makes us think that the cause, the mission, the thing that they are delivering to the end market is something that they are absolutely passionate about, almost irrespective of the intellectual nourishments that they can find in the technology. So that's something we spend a lot of time. And we have a sort of sequence of questions. And I will say, without giving away too many of our sort of thoughts on this, but we will ask a whole load of questions that maybe purport to ask one thing, and really they're asking about another. So you might, for example, ask what is someone's some sort of really far out question might be to ask the founders, do they know one another's political philosophy quite well? And what you're really asking there is not what is their political philosophy, because you don't really care, but what you do care about is, do the founders know one another's political philosophy? How well do they know one another? How well do they get on? How likely is the founder relationship to perpetuate? It might also tell you, depending on whether they are if they're a little bit to the right, it's possible that they will end up wanting to build sort of fresh utilities. If they're a little bit more leaning towards left, they might be more like the kinds of people wanting to build security companies. Now, none of these things are fail safes, but we're just looking to basically get sort of aesthetic indicators as to what is going to keep the founder hooked on the problem that they're taking to market, and not suddenly a little bit bored of the project in 3 years' time. So that's another thing. And I mean, in terms of then the sort of the technical backgrounds that ended up being sort of good versus sort of less good, it's amazing. And this is, by the way, this goes right the way through our interview process for people joining Geometry to people building portfolio companies. Is what's interesting is it's not always the people with a PhD from Harvard or Princeton, or in fact, I've almost got to the point that when you see that kind of blue chip name, the mental setup suddenly becomes, I'll chat to them and it's great and they're clearly very bright, but it's not quite the sort of street smart, autodidactic, intellectually aggressive person who often actually comes from that kind of background. That's a terrible generalization. I just mean it's remarkable how many people come along and they don't have an undergraduate degree, or maybe they do have an undergraduate degree in the discipline, but they're not sort of domain experts. But their level of intellectual aggression has been breathtaking and is often probably a better sign for their ability to battle through a 1 or 2 year sort of R&D hurdle than maybe someone who has been in a kind of who has made an effortless ascent through their academic career and done lots of sort of, you know, sort of very sort of deep and well thought out research, but maybe does not exhibit the level of sort of intellectual aggression that you would want to see in a founder. So yeah, a lot of this now turns on founder personality, and how another thing is, you know, you really want to see complement. I know this is a totally obvious thing to say, but complementary skills in the founder setup. Reasons why there is a relatively low perimeter for dispute at the 2 or 3 or 4 year, you know, really understanding who's going to sort of drive the strategy of the company. It's those sorts of things. And I know that sounds like a very soft science thing for quite Geometry, which likes to pride itself on being a technical investor, but I think we're starting to realize just how important that is.
I absolutely love that answer, because even here at Builderstripe, we spend a lot of time looking at founder psychology, their backgrounds, their story, and more importantly, why are they doing what they're doing, right? And there is a certain intellectual aggression that you look for. And the most important factor that you highlighted was, are they in it for the long run? And how do you perhaps evaluate for that? Because I'm pretty sure most of the founders that would be coming your way, you know, you had the first call and the thing that stands out is, oh, they're very excited about the problem. They have the relevant background. They seemingly have the technical skills lined up as well. So it becomes really tricky to evaluate if the founder is in it for the long run or not. How do you think about that? And maybe what are the questions that you ask to further get an insight into if they are in it for you know, the next 10 years to come?
Well, so I mean, we do all the obvious ones, like, you know, sort of you know, what were they interested in childhood and that sort of thing. But the reality is, people know what you're asking. This is the really hard thing about it. And I'm not saying that they're being that they're sort of everyone's lying all the time, but, you know, inevitably you want to put your best foot forward, and there are some questions where you can just really see what the VC is trying to get on this, and it's totally obvious. But I mean, I think put it this way, that the questions it's easiest to ask about are, or at least with an intention to find out, is things like integrity. Is a much easier thing to devise. I wouldn't say that we've got it completely sorted as to sort of how do we make totally sure that the founder cares so much about this topic. And but there are some types of companies where you have to care more, and some where you have to care less. So the ones where you really have to care more are ones where you are producing some sort of consumer application, and you have to have massive levels of user empathy. I'm not sure that the same necessarily needs to be said let's say, for things around sort of developer infrastructure and security, somehow they're by nature, you're having to make a less opinionated position on what the industry is going to look like in 5-10 years time. So I think it depends a lot on the decision. But yeah, I honestly think that is really, really tough to do. I think often just references can be better as well. What were the things they were going away at 5 o'clock to learn about, or what courses were they going to do, is probably the best way that you can actually find out, are they really in it or not. But asking the founder themselves, it always looks like a targeted question, and you never know whether you're getting a sort of reliable read.
And I think one of the ways to perhaps make up for that would be to evaluate them over a longer time frame instead of just having some more static conversations. And yes, Ayush, I'll nudge you one more time to unmute Tom. But yeah, I think that does make a lot of sense. So I want to kind of move back to talking about networks, right? You mentioned that speculation was a very effective way for us to bootstrap the activity that we've gotten so far. Do you think further speculation by, let's say, options markets would continue to help us drive that adoption that we're looking for, or do you see a certain, change in the fork in the road coming up, where maybe, let's say, DeFi or even broader networks may not, find speculation to be as effective anymore to drive further activity on networks?
It's really tricky because I have to admit that, the success has been had so far. Those early liquidity moats have been won by the sort of ephemeral magic return of the beans that the protocol or the application is about to emit, and that is a sort of a reality. But the other reality is that perfectly serious funds sort of have started to insinuate or require the insinuator sort of require founders to insinuate a token into their round. And this, sort of founders gradually over time realize that, for example, their hires are, so for example, talent in companies was sort of in some ways a second wave, I would say addict, but you know what I mean, sort of talent in companies started to determine which company were they going to join, because one has a token and one doesn't. And so I think sort of investors to some extent started this, and then talent started to kind of get hooked on it as well. I was confounded by the fact that, I think if you reverse back to maybe even sort of mid 2020, and there was this distant roar of the engines from this thing called Polygon, and they were, as far as we felt, sort of behind us from a sort of technological, not that we were going after the same thing, but we sort of, we felt sort of in a good position from a technological standpoint, and we just saw them race past us and generate a whole load of transaction volume, and it has worked. I think the question, though, is that there is now this economic debt. So there's all these people that at the end of a market have essentially allowed the creation of a wealth transfer from retail to the people who owned the assets in the very first place. And it gives a sort of it puts a very big moral question over the industry. Is the industry doing this without having understood how, if a holder had bought the asset and still holds it in 20 years, how in 20 years' time the asset is still substantiating its value then as much as it is now? So if they may have sold out, well, that's very hard to repair, but you want to make sure that these assets are actually cartridges for capital. They are somehow economic extractors. But the difficulty also is these assets are mostly attached to protocols whose kind of prime point of sale to the user is, we are not going to change. This protocol is a really safe place to do business because so few changes are going to be made on top of it. We're not going to continually rebuild the aircraft in midair.
Yeah.
Comes a point at which this is a very safe and stable and unchanging place to do business. That's also then begs the question, well, why is the token then extracting value when there's no delivery of an improvement of service back to the protocol? Now, people are trying to sort of do this with sort of foundations, trying to work out how those cash flows can actually cycle around, but it's obviously very, very hard. I think that's all I sort of really want to say on that. I mean, and I think, look, what we would like to see long run is we'd like to see nation states grant legal personhood to smart contracts. Would be a very nice thing to see. Give the company the upgrade that it has long been overdue, move it from a paper-based system to a system of sort of, a company can be registered through the creation of a smart contract. Would be a real advance. And then you can start to create a binding between the executive, particularly the application layer, where this is really important, the executive and the beneficiaries of the economic surplus in the application. And then we can start talking. And then these tokens start to become securities in the best sense of the word. And they have a real claim on economic extraction. They have a way to incentivize the team building the application to keep on improving the service. And then, of course, we've got sort of listing questions, but that's really for kind of regulators to decide. But I think there is a nice end game that's available here. I think, unfortunately, too many people have probably issued tokens, and even if they didn't intend to dump them on retail, the reality is they get to the end of a cycle and they say, oh, we can't incentivize anyone anymore. We can't keep people. We did sell out during the upswing. And so something that wasn't intended to be a huge wealth transfer did end up as a wealth transfer. And I do think that's problematic.
One of the points that you mentioned was maximizing economic surplus for security capital and then taking the excess of this asset after burning. And then there's this point in your research day talk where you talk about taking this excess and giving it to stakers. Do you want to perhaps expand on this and tell us about the L1 design principles that you've highlighted before? And then from there, perhaps we could branch off into MEV burn and talk about your thoughts on that.
As a general principle, my sort of sense is that the job, so L1 and L2, I do regard as a little bit different. So I'm as you know, I'm a bit of a fan of restaking in the context of first of all, ETH being the principal denomination asset on ETH and Sol on Solana and whatever, right? So if as and when sort of, there's sort of a major L2 market there. But generally the native L1 asset being probably the most stable, liquidity-rich expression of validator capital for all of that layer 1's descendants. So layer 2s and layer 3s and whatever other forms of kind of digital security that we require. It's probably the best asset. The reason I say this, I tie this back to the history of certain kinds of developing countries, particularly actually in South America. You saw this where these countries were issuing debt both in their local currency, which was better for their cash flow matching, by the way, as a form of debt. And they were also sometimes tapping US markets, because what they were able to do is, even though the debt issued in USD, I should say, the debt issued in USD versus the native currency was the same credit risk, was the same risk of default to the person who owned the debt, but the denomination, the currency exposure, is a lot less risky to most people if they have the USD version than the non-USD version. And so what that meant was the interest rate was a lot lower. And so what did that mean? It meant that for the same level of interest rate, of interest payment on an annual basis, the country was able to raise a lot more in the way of borrowings. So I think it's a similar game for infrastructure security. What do you want? You want, for efficiency, you want the lowest possible return on investment for the holder. That sounds like a bad thing.
Yeah.
But what I mean is the ratio between the amount of security fee being paid to the stakers divided by the total amount of stake on a steady state basis, you want to be as low as possible. That is not the same as saying, I want to pay the least amount of security fee to people. What you're really saying is, for the amount of security fee that's available, I want to attract the largest amount of stake. And so that's why I'm quite in favor of ETH denominated or Sol denominated or whatever validator markets. So that's that's one thing. So therefore, what has ETH got to do? It's got to make, in order to make that return as low as possible, it's got to make its denomination asset, which is ETH itself as an unstaked asset, as liquidity rich and price stable as possible. And so that's its only game. What it doesn't need to do is return an even higher cash flow to the unstaked ETH. And this is kind of my one objection to some of the things that we've been thinking about is you want to really take all of any cash flow that is not required simply to maintain a fairly constant supply of ETH. I think the excess should probably be repurposed and paid over to the validators to attract more and more and more validator capital. Okay, so that's sort of my sense for layer one. Layer two, similar. My sense, though, is in the long run, what is going to happen with things like Eigenlayer is the native L2 asset is in many cases the only thing that you can stake on day one. Then in comes Eigenlayer, says, oh, you can also stake ETH. And then the network realizes, wow, the ETH stake is only, it needs to be paid 2%. And the native asset needs to be paid 8% because it's a riskier asset.
Yeah.
So more and more and more, the number of dollars staked into the network denominated in ETH versus the native asset increases. And over time, therefore, the liquidity of the native asset falls. And could you end up, therefore, in a sort of in a death spiral where actually ETH is now the dominant asset that's being used across all those L2s? And so again, have we then had that round trip where we issued the token because it was the thing we needed to bootstrap transaction volume on the network? The token rose. Then we realized, oh, restaking, and then the price of the token starts to fall away again. And there's been basically a wealth transfer because there wasn't a sort of continuing sort of virtuous long-term role for the token. So question mark, but that's my sense of where we're likely to end up.
Yeah, I think some really interesting models for us to evaluate L1s and L2s as networks. Let me perhaps take a stab at trying to summarize what you said. And then if there are any gaps that you'd like to fill in, please feel free to do so. And then perhaps post that, we could jump into audience questions as we move towards the final leg of the 15 minutes.
Do you want me to very quickly comment? I think you mentioned MEV burn and
yes.
Basically, with the design of all of these systems, where do we send our cash? Do we send it to the unstaked token? So the moment you're burning something, typically you are paying it to the unstaked version of the asset. And there is also then the option to kind of pay it directly to the validators. Now, there are some problems with paying it to the next validator because there are certain types of sort of risks involved, sort of coercion. So basically, yeah, you want to make sure that you are as much as possible spreading the cash flow out across lots of validators. I would always say, if you've got MEV, first of all, MEV is very problematic for a layer 2 or layer 1 because it's the network kind of adversarially acting against its own users, which is kind of a weird concept. But if you're going to collect that cash flow, to the extent that you want to collect it at the network level, my leaning would be always push it across to the validators so that you attract more validator capital and make your network sort of maximize for economic security would be my lean. And that's all I've really said about MEV burn.
No, that definitely makes a lot of sense. So essentially, if I would try to put this in a nutshell, an L1's job is to create policies for monetary stability, which create cheap validator capital. And then this abundance of validator capital makes you a good, stable asset where people store things, check proofs, and you would ideally want to burn the L1 asset and play the cash flow game, right? And as you kind of go from there, you talk about L2s. It's may or may not be necessary for an L2 to have a native asset, right? Denominating transactions in the native asset is where a lot of value would lie. and this is metered by gas. And then as you go up the layers of this infrastructure, I want to tie this back into something you spoke about earlier, which is about the risk of doing these mid-flight changes too frequently. And a way of thinking about this would be, as you go up the layers of infrastructure for improvements, risk kind of increases by doing these mid-flight changes. Perhaps you could do these at the L2s or the L3s, and that's when you think about giving out higher APYs for the risk that these people take. So I think there is a lot more that I would love to kind of drill down on further, but we can also dig into these audience questions. And let me just quickly open up the chat here. I also have a host of questions that came in as a part of the registration process as well. So obviously, you did mention that you would want to comment on this statement that Adarsh has put in the chat, that Rust is computationally lighter than Solidity. And that's classic dev speaking, but anything that you'd want to kind of talk about?
I'm interested to hear what Dash has to say on Rust being computationally lighter than Solidity. I want to know whether he's on the.
Okay, Adarsh, while you kind of put that in the chat, Tushar has a question here. Okay. What are your thoughts on solo founders? Right, you did mention you talk about these co-founders existing in perpetuity. So how do you think about solo founders?
Yeah, look, we've got a couple of, we've never said no to solo founders. I think sort of VC is riddled with kind of these heuristics. You must do this, you can do this, you can't do this. And I'm not sure. I think where the fear about solo founders, I believe, came from, Sequoia had this knockout fund in the 1990s, was incredibly sort of well performing, and obviously there were other VC funds to compare to as well. And I think my understanding is someone sat down and did the number crunching and determined that the success rate so the elevated failure rate from solo founder companies was enormous. And I think that the reasoning that the industry came to was, well, a solo founder simply, I mean, aside from this obviously running under the bus risk and all that kind of stuff, what happens if something happens to them and they're taken out and then the company's over? The reasoning was a solo founder is not very well positioned to absorb the massive existential sort of stress that the founder is going through. And I must admit, we were lucky at Aztec. We had I guess two sort of main co-founders originally, and then two others who joined very, very soon after and were essentially sort of co-founders of the company, very much co-founders of the company, in fact, and one's still there. And just being able to share with them those dreads and not having to internalize it all was so monumentally helpful that I think that's everyone got to the assumption, okay, well, it's very hard for it's very hard for a sort of solo founder to bear that level of stress throughout the entire time of the company. And often the company might also pivot to something very successful. And it might be, and actually this exactly happened to Aztec, it might be that it pivots to the thing that the other co-founder is actually more the domain expert. So with Aztec, we were starting off trying to import yielding assets onto Ethereum, which is why we started looking at privacy. And we were trying to basically build an on-chain balance sheet so that you could do duration transformation, because my governing assumption at the time was no one's ever going to be crazy enough to leverage their ETH, which is exactly what they ended up doing. So I was totally wrong on that. And then we started looking into privacy, and it started becoming more a cryptography company than it was a DeFi company. And so actually that's how Aztec started. And that's a very good example of where it looked like it was leaning towards one founder and actually ended up being very much in the expertise of the other founder. So I'm in favor generally of co-founders, but there are a few occasions when we have made an exception. I think that's absolutely fine. But often that without any question, that is always a highly technical founder with an unusually strong level of business intuition, which is just incredibly rare.
Yeah, so there was another question that was also asked. what do you think about move-based virtual machines? And do you think they have the capacity to, imbibe network effects the same way EVM has? And maybe perhaps you could branch out into thinking about more generalized mental model when it comes up, when it comes to thinking about these new virtual machines as well.
So first of all, I'm not deeply familiar with Move. What I am familiar with is I've looked at several companies trying to do this, and generally the sort of the stated advantage is more about the state management rather than necessarily the instruction set itself. And it tends to be, well, we can solve race conditions better because we have better partitioned states that lots of proofs can all be operating on code at the same time. We have more resolution of race conditions. I have to say, I'm not really an expert on it. And actually, funny enough, the two companies that I did speak to that were originally building ZK moves have both either pivoted away or folded. But I don't think that's necessarily a reflection of the project. But I don't think I could really talk particularly interestingly on that subject.
Thank you for that. I think another question that Prasad has here is, what are your thoughts on rollups and the separations of execution and its impact on value accrual for layer ones and layer twos? And more broadly, we would also kind of love to get some more insight into your thoughts on sequencer designs. I know you've spoken about shared sequencers before, but yeah, how do we think about rollup separating execution and then its impact on value accrual?
So yes, I mean, I guess sort of probably people are mostly familiar here with this Suave proposal, which mutualizes the role of the sequencer. My leaning is still towards sequencing. To me, looks like something that ought to be orchestrated at the layer 2 on a network by network basis. But there are some benefits for some mutualizing. So I mean, one advantage of a mutualized sequencer across multiple L2s is it will improve the degree to which you can get a concept of sort of atomic. I mean, I think there are some basic principles, which is we would like lots of people to be able to participate in sequencing. You could say, actually, by the way, one of the things that has always been talked about as an advantage of something like the state architectures associated with ZK move type rollups is this greater partitioning of state, which does mean, in theory, lots of smaller fry actors could participate in sequencing. The sequencing could therefore become more decentralized. I also think, by the way, though, I think this matters, but I'm not sure, because I think that a lot of on-chain transactions are going to end up being private non-financial transactions. An enormous number are going to be private non-financial transactions, at which point the opportunity for value extraction drops precipitously to the sequencer. Yeah. So the moment that the sequencer doesn't really know what's going on under the hood of the transaction, the harder value extraction, for obvious reasons, becomes. So I think that's, I don't know whether that's a useful answer, but.
No, I really appreciate that answer. And I think one of the things that I'd also like to talk about is app chains. To add a little more color to the questions around app chains that we've received in context of the session, there are a lot of use cases which are okay with certain trade-offs. So I remember you once mentioned that my dump tweet does not need to be on a 1400 validators. It's not probably the best use of their DA capabilities. So with what that kind of highlights for me is a different combination of certain designs that you could have for certain use cases. So with that being a direction that we seemingly are headed in, do you think that app chains are something that you're leaning towards with different flavors for each particular use case popping up, or do you have any thoughts to kind of drill deeper here?
I think we will need it. The trouble is that the threshold for doing business on chain is still very, very expensive. And there's this kind of funny cat and mouse thing, which is it's very expensive. So the people wanting to build the kinds of things that are very, very cost sensitive don't come, and there's this sort of recursive problem that until someone comes along and says, we will give you the kind of data availability guarantees of just sort of 10 or 12 times replication, which, by the way, is what Dfinity was doing. That was exactly their thesis, was let's bring the data guarantees tumbling down to order of, I don't know, a dozen nodes that stores each bit of data. And that was their thesis. That was that this is how you run social media and you allow video streaming and all this kind of stuff. I suppose the question is then, do I really need to be on Web3 to do all those things? That's another big question as well. We backed this company called Slush, who were doing that. It is a massively cyclical company to build. You need people to be so open to experimentation and so sensitive to gas costs at the height of a cycle to be able to get a good experimentation surface for anyone building an L3, which means that an L3 company is incredibly difficult to time, because you can only really show off the virtues of what L3 is offering. And by the way, what L3 means is reducing the security assumptions, as you say, particularly on the DA side of things. I think sort of where is L3? What are we going to mean by it from L3, and sort of where is it going to be used? But really, it's going to at the end of the day, execution costs can tend towards something close to zero, and it's really the data availability. It's sort of where do I store the transaction that is the bit that does not really naturally amortize away. So therefore, it's got to be a reduction in the redundancy of the data in the app that is going to be where L3 start to make their mark. And what that means is I need to be at the height of an upcycle for data availability to be so crushingly expensive, even after we have introduced 4844, after we've had this huge drop off in the costs of data availability on Ethereum, that people still are feeling the pain and want to go and experiment on L3.
There's a lot of food for thought here in that discussion, and perhaps I think as we are coming to a close, Tom, any thoughts that you want to share? If you want to tell us more about geometry, let's say a founder, what's the best way for a founder to reach you? And also, let's say if somebody who wants to work at geometry, what would you be looking for in some of these candidates? And any closing remarks that you'd like to kind of share with us?
Yeah, so anyone who wants to get in touch, hello@geometry.xyz is the best way to get in touch. That email goes through to all of us, so we all see it. So it's not just an inbox that's forgotten somewhere. Now, I'm afraid it was for a few months. Yeah, I mean, as I think I've said, we do like investing in sort of research-rich projects. It's a good reason why we think we may have edge in sort of assessing the founder. Definitely anyone looking at the developer experiences, that's very interesting to us. And I think it's amazing how, also don't, as a founder, it's very easy also to look at the current value extraction surface of the market and say, it just looks too small. I heard someone saying this about a company that's doing some sort of basically EVM simulation the other day. And someone said, well, don't they get a 10% cut of the audit market? And the audit market, whilst very high margin and very lucrative for all of the auditors, isn't that big. And if they only get 10% of that, it's not a huge market. But that's not where you should look. We always use Web 2 comps as the point of comparison for a baseline revenue universe. I think an input assumption is Web 3 can replace Web 2 at almost all layers of the stack. That may be a long run thing, that may be 10 years, could be 15 years, but stateful protocols are going to start trumping non-stateful protocols. And therefore we would use things like, I don't know, a Cisco or a Cloudflare, their cybersecurity lines of revenue as an approximation of the revenue universe. So what I'd say is, don't look at the current visible surface, look up and look out and see what's been done in Web 2. And that's probably a much better guide for the size of the market opportunity than looking at today's environment.
I love that answer. A lot for us to kind of think about here, a lot for founders to kind of work on. I really appreciate you, Tom, kind of taking the time out for doing this session. It was lovely chatting with you. Thank you so much. And it was a pleasure speaking with you.
Likewise, Tanay, thank you so much, and nice to speak to you all.